All right, we're back again. Round 9, round 10. I thought it would be right around this time, Saturday evening, and here we are. So everything kind of went how I thought it would go. Going into these picks, as everybody knows, I started with 3 QBs, not realizing Josh Allen and Daniel Jones had the same bye. Actually, here's what we're looking at right now in terms of the start thus far through 8 rounds. Josh Allen, Daniel Jones, went Geno Smith at the 312. 401 went Ramondre Stevenson. Doubled up at running back, Dameon Pierce, Ken Walker, 5 and 6. Took my first 2 receivers at 7 and 8. Got Drake London at 801. Seemed to be pretty good based on what I've seen out there in other formats or in other divisions. Drake London went a little higher. But anyway, 2 receivers, 3 running backs, 3 quarterbacks through 8 rounds at the 9-10 turn. So I said I'm going to draft this team entirely based off WoRP, trying to build it based on what's the most favorable based on these scoring settings. So with this, here's the WoRP graph. Shout out to South Harmon, southharmonff.com/WoRP. Check out the WoRP tool. You can literally sync it directly with your My Fantasy League or Sleeper Leagues and get the WoRP. You can go back 15 years of WoRP. You can go back all the way to 2007, seeing what the distribution looks like. And for more on that, we're going to be releasing a WoRP series called Mind Warped. Myself and Adam from 4D Chess. Shout out to Adam, 4D Chess Pod. That's going to be coming out early August. Going to talk all about it. Literally go through 24 hours, most likely. It's going to be 20 to 30 hours of just basically a WoRP class talking about it and how to apply it to different formats. So I said, you know what? I'm going to draft my Scott Fishbowl team based on WoRP. So that's where we're at. 9-10 turn. So I'm going to eliminate tight end. I'm not taking a tight end here. Pat Fryermuth just went a couple picks ago. I committed to punting tight end. I may have considered taking him, but we're going to eliminate him from the board. Quarterbacks, as much as I would love to take another quarterback just because, especially because I have 2 quarterbacks that are going to be off in the same week, one of them being a playoff week. There are a couple quarterbacks still sitting out there. Looking at what's available right now, best quarterbacks, Brock Purdy, Sam Howell, Mac Jones, Desmond Ridder, Ryan Tannehill, Baker Mayfield, Trey Lance. I don't know. People are taking him. Some people are still counting on him to start. But anyway, let's call it 6 starters that are still out there. I'm going to gamble. I may take one later. I'm not sure. It just depends. But I'm not going to take one here. I'm not going to take a tight end. There's the best tight ends available. Chiggy, Okonkwo, Greg Dulcich. Everyone knows my thoughts on those guys. So no thanks. Running backs and receivers. So that's where I'm focusing. So I'm going to go back to the WoRP tool, eliminate quarterbacks off the graph. So as you can see here, and I talked about roster construction, how I'm going to optimally roster construct this team. So here it is, optimal roster construction, 4 quarterbacks. I'm probably going to end up with 3 because I took them so high. 5 running backs, 3 tight ends, 5 receivers. Given the format, I'm probably going to use these droppable numbers, which are essentially what you're going to use your extra bench spots are before here. I'm going to probably make this like a 10 running back build. I've said 10 or 11. That's probably what I'm going to target. But now I have to decide where I want to take them because optimally what I want to do, and here's these numbers for everybody. You can see the running back WoRP and the wide receiver WoRP all the way until around the edge of the wide receiver 3 spot is essentially where it starts to even up. And at that point, you're like, I'm just going to take running backs. So right there, that speaks to the fact that if you extended this all the way out, running backs are going to outpace receivers or at least be right alongside them. Even though those running backs from a sit-start perspective are probably going to give you negative WoRP for the season. Again, this is a lineup league, so you're going to be able to spot start running backs in this format, and it's beneficial to do that, hence the 10 running back or 11 running back build that I'm striving for. But I do need to have receivers. I want to target receivers somewhere in this range. Here's how you read this WoRP graph. I want to target receivers somewhere in this range where I want to make sure I get my 5 in this range right here, inside the top 36, and that makes sense. But it also tells me I don't want to draft them out here. So I'm probably not going to get there, but I can tell myself a story where I end up with 5, maybe 6, but I'm probably going to roll with 5. I end up with 5 that could get into that range or at least drafted in that range. So let's go back to what's available. Wide receivers and running backs, best running backs available, James Cook, Antonio Gibson, Zach Charbonnet. Not really interested in taking another Seattle back. I like Antonio Gibson, but I also think there's some other players later that I can bank on getting some carries, guys like Tyler Algier, Damian Harris, those types I can draft later, Jamal Williams. I can take those guys maybe in a round. So really, I think this is the time where I'm going to have to take more receivers. I don't love it. I've seen some other builds where people have gotten a little better value on receivers, and our draft has been pretty moderate at drafting them. There have been a couple rooms where if you would have taken this approach, The way they're drafting receivers in some other divisions, you would have been able to just hammer running back. Our division has been a little smarter. They've eaten up more running backs, almost at a 1-to-1 ratio compared to some other rooms where it's been more like 1.2 to 1. So our room has been pretty smart. They have not overdrafted receivers despite the market sentiment that receivers are king right now in fantasy. So here we go. Best available. Got to make sure I check the bye weeks, but I'm locked in on receiver. I think this is a dead zone range of running backs. I would have considered Zach Charbonnet, but I don't really want a handcuff in this format, and I already drafted Ken Walker, so it gives me a little more upside if I don't draft a handcuff. So here we go. Back to the WoRP graph. Want to try to get 5 receivers in this range. I'm probably going to be able to get 4. So what does it make sense to do here? Michael Pittman, you know what? I was out on Michael Pittman, but I've started to warm up a little bit as to Michael Pittman could be somebody that's a second-half surge guy just based on some of the stuff about RPO offenses. I don't love the situation, but you're obviously not going to get situations you love at receiver at this point in the draft. So I think Michael Pittman is a pick. He's obviously fallen pretty far down in ADP. I mean, right here, you're looking at all the way at pick 108. And he off the board right around 90. It doesn't really matter, but this is pretty good value for him. And that's essentially what I've done. I did that with Drake London. Going to take the falling value here with Michael Pittman. So that's going to be my first pick. So we're going to lock in Michael Pittman. With the second pick, that's where I have to make a decision, right? So JSN's the next receiver off the board. I kind of like that. Does not have a conflicting bye week. Michael Pittman was week 7 or week 11. The next available. Obviously, I want to avoid week 13. So JSN, week 5. Zay Flowers, I already passed on potentially J.K. Dobbins earlier for that reason. So he's out. Obviously, Jalen Hyatt, Gabriel Davis. I considered Gabe Davis and Jalen Hyatt as options later if I wanted to go like a 5th or 6th receiver just for a stack. Problem is, I probably don't want to draft one of those guys in my top 5 that have the same buy as the quarterbacks because I'm already going to be eating it that week. So I think it makes sense to go JSN because I know if I get to that point, if I get to week 13 and I don't have Daniel Jones and I don't have Josh Allen, you have to basically beat out like 10% of the field in that week to advance to the next round. So it's not at the end of the world if you have bye weeks. But that's probably where I want to have a little stack, right? So I think it makes sense to go JSN. I know redraft, he's a little risky. I mean, obviously Seattle has 3 receivers that are essentially going in the top 40 receivers off the board. And that's probably not going to be sustainable unless Geno Smith is awesome. But there's some correlation there. It gives me a stack for the week that I know I'm probably going to be using Geno Smith. So I'm just going to eat up the value. He's technically the next receiver off the board, but as you can see here from the ADP data, pretty flatlined in terms of the next tier of 8 to 10 receivers. So we're going to lock in JSN with the aforementioned Michael Pittman. And boom, there's the squad through 10 rounds, 3 quarterbacks, 3 running backs, 4 receivers. What I've hoped to have accomplished at this point is have locked in at least my core receivers inside this range. Again, 1 versus running backs, they're not favorable. But you also probably don't want to end up having to fight for receivers down here that much. So from here on out, I'm going to be very selective which ones I take. Obviously, I don't want the guys I drafted to finish here. I prefer they finish somewhere in this range. Gives me a much closer shot of hitting some of the teams that drafted their receivers up here. And again, the names here that I'm highlighting don't matter. It's the distribution of the production, which is largely pretty sticky from year to year. So teams that have drafted these guys in the first 2 to 3 rounds, what I need is a couple of the players that I've taken here to end up somewhere in this range. Possible, not probable, but that's the whole risk when taking receivers like this too early. You're betting they get to here, because obviously you would not want to be taking them over these running backs. Now, the same here. It's a little closer as you get into this range. But even so, you want your receivers to probably end up somewhere in this 12 to 30 range versus all the way down here at the tail at wide receiver 36. So I'm going out of town tomorrow, so I'll be back on Monday if my picks come up before then. But definitely looking forward to building out the rest of this team. 12 more roster spots to go. Like the team build, don't 100% love it. I've seen a couple others on Twitter. I'm going to give a shout out to my boy, Eric Vanek, NFL, and my other boy, Scott Stevens at FF Stockbroker. Both of them have built pretty good teams. They posted it in the Patreon chat, like both of them. Scott's especially. Talk about playing to the format. Running back hammers. I think he had 6 running backs in the first 12 rounds, something like that, 13 rounds. I have to go back and look. I don't have it in front of me right now. But shout out to both of them. They've built pretty good squads. I've seen some people post their squads on Twitter, and I'm like, you know what? I can tell who kind of is taking a format-based approach versus just a typical underdog or redraft-based approach that you see out there. You know, the builds where someone takes 6 receivers in the first 10 picks. Maybe it'll work. Obviously does not play into this format. And again, shout out to Scott Fish for creating a format at a time when everybody is just absolutely obsessed with going hero RB, wide receiver crazy. He creates a format that could not devalue that strategy less. So shout out to Scott Fish. Find the WoRP tool, southharmonff.com/WoRP. Check it out. You can try it for a month. Also donate to Fantasy Cares, fantasycares.org. Again, I said part of the Patreon from the month of July will go to Fantasy Cares when this month ends. So appreciate everybody that tuned in, and we'll be back for the round 11 and 12 turn picks. Be chill.